Eagerly anticipating the upcoming vacation with friends, I imagined how delightful it would be to enjoy the time, thanks to the credit card that opened up so many opportunities for me. However, Thomas's recent behavior was troubling me. He had called me late at night on his way home, and it seemed like he was secretly talking to Samantha on the phone. His nervousness at home heightened my suspicions, as if he was plotting something behind my back. I started wondering, could all of this be part of some secret plan? My doubts grew, as it felt like Thomas and Samantha were scheming together. I was ready for anything. Perhaps I should have acted shocked while listening to Thomas's explanations, but deep down, I already knew he had plans to leave for a trip today. It seemed strange, almost absurd. Didn't he realize that I wasn't so easily fooled? I wished Thomas would be more careful with his moves. I had been patient for a long time, trying to ignore his odd behavior, but today, that patience had run out. The desire for revenge was growing inside me, and I always had a plan ready to turn the game upside down. It was time to show Thomas and his sister that I would no longer silently observe their actions. After so many days of patience and restraint, I was sure that by the end of this day, everything would fall into place. Let them enjoy their trip, for they have no idea that there is another player in this game, hidden behind a mask. My name is Kelly Brooke, and I'm 36 years old. I live in the same house with Thomas, my husband, and we've been together for many years. My story began after high school when I immediately plunged into work, eager to achieve something significant. With experience and recommendations from my superiors, I earned several important certifications that opened up career opportunities for me. My rise in the company was swift. By 23, I had already landed a management position, which was a huge achievement for me, as I was the youngest person ever to hold that role. Though it was just a managerial position, it meant a lot to me. With quiet determination, I aimed to climb the career ladder and one day lead a department. Over time, the company welcomed new faces, and one of them was Thomas. Although he was older than me, I outranked him in the company. My job was to train Thomas and a few other newcomers, and from then on, our paths began to cross. Thomas often admired my career growth and experience, and his attention toward me became more evident. At first, I hesitated, but gradually, I found myself falling for him. I began to notice Thomas's careless habits, which hadn't been so apparent before. At first, they alarmed me, but over time, I decided that perhaps this was his way of revealing his true self to me, showing that he trusted me and no longer hid behind a mask of perfection. Oddly enough, I began to like these changes. They made him seem more real, more alive, and I tried not to give too much thought to these little details, letting go of my worries. When Thomas proposed to me, I didn't hesitate to say yes. It was time to talk about our future, and in that conversation, Thomas was surprisingly candid. "I'd like you to be a housewife," he said, as if this was the best possible destiny for me. He wanted to work and earn money, while I would take care of the home and our household. The perfect, in his mind, balance. He provides, I create comfort. In his eyes, this was an ideal arrangement. Thomas dreamed of a family, a house of our own, and a wedding that he saw as the start of our new life together. His plan was strict and clear: first the wedding, then buying a house, and then children. As I listened, I politely nodded and agreed that his sequence of actions seemed reasonable. But inside, doubts were growing. "Thomas, that really does sound wonderful," I began, choosing my words carefully. "But we need to consider the financial side of things, especially how it will affect our savings. Also, I don't plan to quit my job, even when we have children. We can make our work schedules more flexible and share responsibilities evenly." Thomas listened attentively, but I could see that he was troubled by the fact that I earned more than he did. He dreamed of owning a house, and his desire to speed up the process suggested that he didn't fully grasp the potential challenges. I tried to calm him, pointing out that buying a house right after the wedding could be difficult. "Let's focus on organizing the wedding, and we can buy a house a little later." Besides, we need to figure out how we'll manage finances if I continue working. Thomas sighed but agreed. There was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes, but he understood that without my income, our plans could be at risk. I proposed the idea not only for financial reasons, but also because I didn't want to leave my job. Deep down, I feared that if I gave in too easily, Thomas might continue to push his expectations on me. During our engagement, we hosted a small party for both families. Samantha, Thomas's sister, was away and couldn't attend, but I met her for the first time at our wedding. That moment is etched in my memory. Samantha burst into the preparation room without knocking. With a smirking glance, she said, "Well, this is Thomas's choice. A bit simpler than his ex, but she'll do." Her sharpness took me aback. I tried to remain polite and responded, "I'm Kelly." "It's nice to meet you," but inside, I was fuming at her brazen attitude. "Oh yeah, I'm Samantha, your new sister-in-law." Straightforwardness is a family trait, she added before leaving the room without saying goodbye. That first encounter left a bitter taste. She was clearly someone who wouldn't be easy to get along with. Later, I met her husband, who fortunately turned out to be much more composed and reasonable. Unlike Samantha, he gave off a calm and measured vibe, which was a relief to me. The wedding itself went off beautifully and smoothly, just as we had planned. Thomas and I finally bought a house that we both loved. However, from the moment we moved in, life seemed to speed up, and I threw myself into work, determined not to miss any opportunity for professional growth. One day, while I was absorbed in my routine, there was an unexpected knock at the door. I asked Thomas to answer it, thinking it wasn't anything important. Soon, I heard laughter in a familiar voice. It was Samantha. She had decided to drop by unannounced. "Kelly, hey, look at Thomas. What a big house he has." "It's really great for him," Samantha commented with a smirk, settling comfortably on the couch as if she were at home. There was a slight sting in her tone, but I held my tongue. "After all, he's my little brother," she continued, proudly glancing around. I, meanwhile, was lost in thoughts of how much I had worked to make this house ours. But Thomas seemed content to let his sister believe that he had provided everything himself. He acted as if the house was entirely his. Samantha was clearly misled, and Thomas wasn't in any hurry to correct that impression. His behavior made me doubt his sincerity, and I couldn't shake the feeling. The house we lived in was the result of our combined efforts. I had contributed a significant portion of the down payment and continued to pay the mortgage, even though Thomas insisted that only his name should appear on the ownership papers. In the end, I agreed, thinking that since we were a family now, there was no need to get hung up on such formalities. But now, watching him brag in front of his sister, a wave of resentment surged through me. I decided not to make a scene, though it wasn't easy to hold back. Choosing not to escalate the situation, I offered Thomas and his sister some snacks. "Here are a few treats," I said with forced lightness in my voice. "Thomas has been working hard, you know," I added, trying to smooth things over. But Samantha, sensing something in my tone, smirked with clear irritation. "Why does Kelly sound so responsible, like she's the boss or something?" she asked sarcastically. I felt a wave of awkwardness wash over me, but I quickly recovered. "Well, actually, I am Thomas's boss at work," I said calmly, knowing that this information would surprise her. "Oh, Thomas didn't tell you?" I continued with a small smile. When I joined the company, Kelly was already a manager, Thomas reluctantly admitted, feeling uncomfortable under his sister's sharp gaze. It just so happened that she started working right out of high school. Samantha eyed me thoughtfully. Wait, you finished school early and look so responsible, but still less successful than me," she remarked mockingly, trying to provoke me. Her words were full of hidden arrogance. "Is there a problem with the fact that I didn't finish school?" I replied calmly, trying to keep a peaceful tone. "Not exactly," Samantha smirked. But, Kelly, since you didn't graduate high school and I'm your sister-in-law, I can ask you for anything, right? That's kind of how family works, she joked, though her tone hinted she wasn't entirely kidding. Her gaze was full of blatant audacity, and her words were openly aggressive. To my surprise, Thomas backed her up. Kelly, whatever my sister wants, she should get. If you refuse, I'll have to ask you to leave the house, he said with a seriousness that bordered on absurdity. I was stunned by his words. How did not having a high school diploma and her status as my sister-in-law give her the right to demand anything from me, let alone threaten me with eviction from my own home? The situation was so ridiculous that I could hardly believe my ears. I just smiled politely, struggling to hold back harsh words, and quickly headed to the kitchen. I needed time to gather my thoughts and process what had just happened. From the kitchen, I could still hear their conversation, their voices faint but clear enough to tell they weren't joking. Not long after, Samantha, not giving me even a minute to breathe, walked into the kitchen. As usual, she was casual and self-assured. "Hey, Kelly," she said with a tone as if we were best friends, "I really need to ask you for a favor." Her gaze, though attempting to seem friendly, revealed a hidden tension, and I instinctively braced myself for what I knew would be an uncomfortable conversation. "What favor?" I asked, unable to hide the hint of concern in my voice, as I had a feeling her request wouldn't be simple. "I need to borrow some money," she said almost casually, as if it was no big deal. "Like $5,000. My eyes widened in shock. $5,000? How could she consider that a small favor? "That's not a small amount, Samantha." I tried to stay calm, but irritation was building inside me. "Why do you need so much money?" "Oh, come on, it's just $5,000. You're a manager, right? You must have a good salary," she said, her voice pushing as if trying to convince me it was really nothing. The whole conversation felt absurd, like we were living in some alternate reality where such requests were normal. Samantha started explaining that she needed the money for home repairs, but I remembered how she had just recently bragged about her new apartment. "Didn't you just say everything was great with your apartment?" I reminded her, hoping to clarify things. "Well, yeah, but it's just for repairs," she waved off, as if trying to steer the conversation elsewhere. "Thomas said he'd lend me the money. He told me to ask you." At that moment, frustration began to swell inside me. Why had Thomas made this decision without consulting me? We were partners, and such things should be discussed. My heart pounded with a sudden feeling of mistrust toward my husband. Why did he decide this without me? I said, more to myself, but Samantha's response snapped me back to the unpleasant reality. "Kelly, either you give me the money, or I'll call your boss right now and tell him you're quitting." My heart skipped a beat at her words, but I quickly composed myself. She had clearly overestimated her influence and was trying to intimidate me. "All right, Samantha," I said, regaining control. "I'll lend you the money, but I have one condition." Her face shifted slightly, the wariness in her eyes obvious. "What condition?" she asked, her voice guarded though tinged with irritation. "We need to draw up a promissory note. Even though we're family, I want this to be documented," I stated firmly. Samantha clearly hadn't expected that. Her eyebrows shot up in surprise, but then, realizing she had no other choice, she reluctantly agreed. "Ugh, fine. That's such a hassle, but okay. If you give me the money, I'll bring the paperwork tomorrow night." Her tone was dripping with discontent, but I knew this was necessary. The next day, when she actually showed up with the required documents and ID, I realized just how important it had been to stand my ground. Samantha grumbled, but she still brought everything. Her reluctance and unwillingness to cooperate only confirmed my suspicions. Her influence over Thomas was too strong, and it was slowly tearing our lives apart. Despite her attempts to seem sincere, I later discovered that the money I lent her wasn't spent on repairs at all. but on expensive designer items. Her audacity shocked me. After the first loan, she started asking for more money. Each time, I insisted on a promissory note, understanding that otherwise, I'd never see my money again. By the end of the month, the amount she had borrowed from me had grown to $112,000. The situation was becoming unbearable. It seemed like my entire life was starting to revolve around Samantha's endless requests. And then, when things reached their peak, I got an unexpected call. It was my boss with some incredible news. I was getting promoted to department manager. It was a major milestone, a step closer to my dream of becoming the head manager. Ecstatic and full of joy, I rushed home to share the news with Thomas. "I'm home, Thomas. Guess what?" I called out as I burst into the house, smiling. Thomas, who had taken the day off, greeted me with a smile. "Welcome home, Kelly. You look so happy. How did it go?" His voice was warm, but I couldn't contain my excitement. "My boss called today. Guess what he offered me?" I exclaimed, full of enthusiasm. I had always dreamed of the day I'd reach my goal of becoming a top manager. This position wasn't just a career step for me, it was the culmination of all the effort I'd poured into my work. And now that I was so close, the feeling of joy overwhelmed me. But Thomas's reaction was far from what I had hoped for. "Wait, what promotion are you getting, Kelly?" His voice wasn't filled with curiosity but with disbelief, and his eyes held a mix of surprise and something deeper, as though he sensed that there was more to this. "Yes, I accepted the promotion," I confirmed with a slight smile. "Haven't I talked to you about my career goals? This is an important step for me." Thomas frowned. "You actually accepted it? Shouldn't you have asked for my permission before making such a decision?" His words hit me like a thunderclap. "Permission?" I echoed, stunned by his tone. "But we've discussed this before, and I made it clear that I wasn't going to give up on my career." "I've always said I want you to be a housewife," Thomas continued irritably, his voice growing harsher. "How is it that you keep advancing so quickly while I'm stuck in the same place?" His words froze me in place. Was this real resentment or jealousy creeping through? Was he more concerned with his own frustrations than my success? I took a step toward him, trying to stay calm. "It's not my fault, Thomas. I'm working on my goals, pushing for my dreams. I can't control why you haven't been promoted." His eyes flashed with discontent, and I realized that this conversation wasn't going to end well. Shortly after our exchange, I noticed Thomas grab his phone and call someone. About 15 minutes later, there was a knock at the door, and in flew Samantha, as confident and self-satisfied as always. "Hey, I heard you stole the promotion that was supposed to go to Thomas," Samantha declared loudly as soon as she stepped through the door. Her voice was filled with accusation, and her tone came across as offensive. I stood there, stunned, unable to believe what I was hearing. "No one stole anything. Promotions are earned based on performance, not connections," I replied, trying to keep my composure. "Are you saying Thomas isn't good enough at his job?" Samantha snapped, clearly twisting my words. She turned to Thomas, expecting his support, and without hesitation, he sided with her. My attempts to explain were in vain. Thomas and Samantha started laughing loudly, exchanging jokes at my expense. At some point, they walked over to my purse, grabbed my bank card without a word, and, ignoring my protests, left the house, slamming the door behind them. I could hear them as they walked away, discussing their plans for the evening, their laughter cutting deep into my heart. I stood in the empty house, struggling to believe this was actually happening. Tears welled up in my eyes, and as I gathered my thoughts, I realized the full extent of my mistake. Thomas wasn't the man I once thought he was. Instead of partnership and love, I was met with betrayal and indifference. At that moment, it became clear to me, I needed to start looking for a divorce lawyer. That night, Thomas didn't come home. The next morning, while I was at work, he approached me with a smug smile, as if nothing had happened. "You have no idea how fun last night was," he said, standing in front of me. "There's nothing like eating and drinking on someone else's dime. Thanks for the treat." With that, he tossed some receipts onto my desk. I stared at them in disbelief. $1,500 for an upscale barbecue, followed by bar tabs from luxury lounges totaling $99,000. My head spun with rage. How could Thomas spend such a ridiculous amount of money? And not just any money, but my savings, which I had accumulated long before we got married. "Thomas, how could you?" I shouted, barely able to contain my anger. "You spent $99,000 on dinners and drinks. That was my money, earned before our marriage." Before I could finish speaking, he, without even attempting to apologize, began complaining about my nagging. When I brought up the fact that he had blown through money I had painstakingly saved before we even married, he didn't even flinch. In a voice dripping with disdain, he shot back, "So what? It's already spent, so who cares?" Then, as if to dodge any responsibility, he locked himself in the bathroom, leaving me standing there in absolute shock. That scene was the last straw in a series of betrayals and humiliations, and in that very moment, I knew I couldn't take it any longer. The decision to divorce came swiftly, and I saw no other way forward. Over the next few days, I visited a lawyer. The preparations for the divorce went surprisingly smoothly, despite Thomas's behavior worsening. He would come home late, seemingly avoiding me on purpose, and in the mornings, he would leave quickly, not giving us a chance to talk or even exchange glances. His coldness and detachment only solidified my confidence in the decision I had made. By the weekend, I was even considering hiring a private investigator. I needed to know where he was and what he had been up to during all that time. Then, unexpectedly, I received a call from Ryan, my brother-in-law. His voice carried an unusual tension that immediately caught my attention. "Hey, is this Kelly?" His tone was strangely formal. "Yes, Ryan, it's me. Nice to hear from you. Is everything okay?" I asked, surprised by the unexpected call, trying to figure out the reason behind it. "You know, I've been meaning to ask you, has Samantha been with you lately?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "No, Samantha isn't here." "Why do you ask?" My interest in the conversation deepened. It turned out that lately, Samantha had started coming home late, disappearing on weekends, and avoiding explaining where she had been. Ryan, worried about her behavior, had asked her about it, and she mentioned being with Thomas. The news froze me in place. At that moment, I realized that Thomas's and Samantha's behavior had become too similar to be a coincidence. Perhaps they really were hiding something. I decided to share my suspicions with Ryan. "You know, Ryan, Thomas has been acting the same way. But honestly, it's not really my problem anymore. I'm already on the brink of divorce," I responded calmly, trying to distance myself from my emotions. Ryan, seemingly shocked by my composure, soon found the strength to continue the conversation. "Wow. Listen, Kelly, I've been thinking about divorce for a while now, but I just couldn't bring myself to take that step," he admitted with a heavy sigh. "Ryan, we have a shared problem. I've gathered enough evidence that could help both of us. Maybe we should use it and teach these reckless siblings a lesson they won't forget," I suggested, realizing that our fates were intertwined, and we could support each other through this difficult time. A surprising bond of understanding and determination began to form between us. Ryan, too, seemed to feel it. "Yes, Kelly, let's work on this together," he agreed, and I heard a note of firm resolve in his voice. Then he mentioned something unexpected and curious. Samantha had been trying to convince him to take a long vacation, and on their vanity table, he noticed several travel brochures. At that moment, It occurred to me that I should investigate the shelf in our home that Thomas always kept secret and never let me touch. My suspicions deepened. And just as I thought, I soon discovered hidden maps and the same travel brochures. Everything started falling into place. Thomas and Samantha were planning a trip, hiding it from us. Their deception was becoming more and more apparent. I immediately called Ryan. "Ryan, they're definitely planning a trip." "I just found proof," I said, feeling our shared plan take shape. This discovery only strengthened my resolve to move forward with the divorce. Now we had all the grounds we needed to hold Thomas and Samantha accountable for their actions. When I shared my plan with Ryan, he couldn't help but laugh, fully on board with the idea. Our conversation ended with the decision to coordinate every step through text messages, ensuring each move was calculated and thought out. I sent him the evidence I had gathered, which could also be useful in his divorce proceedings. We crafted our plans cautiously, knowing that any misstep could cost us dearly. The weeks passed, and our strategy became more refined. 3 weeks later, at dawn, Thomas left the house, confident that his plan was about to succeed. He was full of smugness, something I knew thanks to Ryan, who had warned me the night before. A few hours after Thomas left for his next adventure, he called me from a number I recognized by heart and wasted no time bragging. He gleefully shared how he planned to enjoy the trip with Samantha and their friends, and, of course, use my credit card while doing so. His tone dripped with arrogance, as if he was already celebrating his victory. But unlike him, I was prepared for this game. I smiled to myself, listening to his words, and played along, asking a few innocent questions. "So, you're really using my card?" I asked with a light-hearted tone, masking my true intentions. Thomas, basking in his arrogance, confidently admitted that he and Samantha had been planning this trip for a long time, hiding their intentions all along, thinking I was too naive to notice. He even mentioned that they had Ryan as a backup plan, in case something went wrong. According to him, they had long decided that it was time to teach me a lesson, to stop being so trusting. His words were clearly meant to humiliate me, to make me feel weak and helpless. However, the entire conversation felt more like a comedy, and I couldn't help but smile. I kept questioning Thomas, this time focusing on his comments about my debit card. "Are you sure you took the right card?" I asked, savoring the moment, knowing the climax of the conversation was approaching. Thomas, seemingly confused by my question, quickly reassured me that yes, he had taken my card. At that moment, I calmly told him that my debit card was still in my wallet, and I was certain he had taken something else. There was silence for a few seconds. Then, with a hint of confusion in his voice, Thomas asked what card he had used. I, with restrained satisfaction, replied that he had mistakenly grabbed my old fitness club membership card, which was almost identical in color and size to my debit card. I heard his heavy sigh as he grappled with the realization of his mistake. A moment later, when he looked at the card and saw the words "Fitness Club," Thomas understood his blunder. His grand plan had fallen apart because of a simple mix-up, a ridiculous error that made both me and Ryan burst into laughter. Ryan, who had been listening to our conversation on speaker, couldn't hold back his laughter. This was the moment when their carefully thought-out scheme collapsed, undone by the simplest mistake. Their ambitions for a luxurious getaway at my expense had turned to dust. Thomas, realizing that his plan had failed, tried to shift the blame. It was Samantha. It was her idea. His words sounded like a weak attempt to avoid responsibility, but it was clear that both of them were now in a hopeless situation. I couldn't resist a slight chuckle in response. "Ah, so you were so upset last night that you swapped my debit card for a gym card and didn't even bother to check it in the morning?" I said, enjoying the situation where Thomas found himself cornered by his own arrogance. Thomas, completely flustered, tried to brush off my question, as if hoping this was just a misunderstanding that could easily be fixed. But for me, It was proof of his foolishness and incompetence, and I was now more confident than ever that Ryan and I could successfully carry out our plans. When I heard Thomas, with a hint of defiance, say they had gifts for both of us upon their return, I just smirked internally, paying no attention to his empty promises. It seemed he believed he could buy us off with some trinkets or, even more absurdly, make us dependent on his generous offers. But his confidence quickly faded when I calmly stated that I was only interested in cash. No gifts would suffice. Thomas clearly felt uncomfortable with my refusal to play by his rules, but he continued bluffing, though it was obvious his position was weakening. "We'll see what happens next," he threw out as a final challenge, but I ignored him, focusing on more important things than his idle threats. "What are you going to do now?" he asked, his tone softening, almost pleading. It seemed his confidence had crumbled, and Thomas suddenly realized his plan was falling apart. "Kelly, can you send some money?" His voice took on a desperate tone that gave me a small sense of satisfaction. Unmoved by his pathetic plea, I silently ended the conversation, feeling triumphant. Later, when I picked up my phone again, I saw it was flooded with missed calls and messages. First, I contacted Ryan to check in on our current plans, then decided to respond to Thomas's persistent calls. His voice was full of desperation. "Hey, finally, please send the money. It's freezing here, we're stuck." The reason for their discomfort was obvious. February in Alaska doesn't forgive the unprepared, and the harsh cold seemed to have finally made them realize they were in a trap. The freezing temperatures served as undeniable proof that our plan had worked perfectly. "You mentioned Ryan, didn't you?" I teased, keeping the intrigue alive, and Thomas was clearly confused by his own words. "Or is he not there?" I asked, relishing his disorientation. With each passing second, his confidence melted away. "What do you know?" Thomas's voice betrayed his anxiety. I, not hiding the irony, explained, "Should I remind you that you and Samantha decided to team up with Ryan?" And I, in turn, did the same. It's quite simple. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Thomas now understood that the entire show he and Samantha had carefully prepared had turned against them. This was the ultimate revelation. Ryan and I had managed to intercept their plans and turn the situation in our favor. Thomas, lost and confused, couldn't hide his shock. "Now you see why I kept you on the phone so long during our first conversation," I continued, playing on his emotions. "It was necessary to buy time. And yes, Ryan is currently flying back on a different plane." Every word I spoke hit Thomas like a cold blow, as he had anticipated a completely different outcome. This coordination of our actions, our alliance against the deceit of Thomas and Samantha, had turned into a crushing blow for them. Confident in their victory, they now found themselves stranded, freezing, and humiliated. When I received confirmation that Ryan was already in the air, heading home, I couldn't resist and finally ended the call with Thomas, leaving him with, "We've joined forces to teach you a lesson. Now find your way back on your own. See you around." That was the last word I had in that conversation. I calmly put down the phone, confident that we now held all the cards. A few minutes later, I was dialing my lawyer's number to discuss our next steps. Everything was going according to plan, the divorce proceedings, the final formalities, and soon, Thomas and his companions could be facing the real consequences of their actions. As expected, a few hours later, Thomas and his companions returned. They were furious, their faces showing a mix of anger and bewilderment. "Kelly, what the hell?" Thomas yelled, full of determination to cause a scene. But what awaited him was something completely different. "Ryan took your side, didn't he?" Thomas continued, clearly unable to understand how things had spiraled out of his control so quickly. "Why did you come back before us?" His voice was higher-pitched, almost hysterical. Before I could respond, Ryan, standing calmly beside me, decisively stepped in. "Apologize, Thomas. Now shut your mouth and sit down." This command was given with such authority that Thomas and his friend instantly complied, shocked by the power Ryan held in that moment. "Wait, is this a property search?" Thomas muttered in disbelief, his voice wavering as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. Shifting his tone, he tried to regain his confidence but couldn't hide the tremor in his voice. Ryan, resolute, simply replied, "Yes, that's correct." Ryan's question, full of irony and bitter truth, led Thomas to a sudden realization of the gravity of the situation. His face paled as the looming reality of the divorce tightened around him like a noose. His inner world flipped upside down, and he still seemed unable to grasp the depth of the hole he had dug for himself. "I've mentioned this before, haven't I?" I pressed, guiding him toward the inevitable conclusion. "I want half of the down payment we made on the house, plus the remaining mortgage balance. And I want the savings you spent while I was on my own." I laid out my demands firmly, and also addressed Samantha, who stood by his side with an obviously displeased expression. "And you, Samantha, you'll return the money you borrowed from me along with the amounts you withdrew from my savings," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on her. Thomas tried to brush aside my words, but it didn't work. "That's not true," Samantha responded with growing concern. "You're wrong. Thomas was the one who bought the house, and I never borrowed or spent that money. These are false accusations." I simply shook my head. "Samantha, look at the documents. There's a loan agreement that clearly outlines how much you owe." I pointed to the papers, unfazed by their protests. "Without proof, I'll just dismiss this as meaningless," she retorted, trying to downplay the seriousness of the situation. But Thomas and Samantha, acting rashly, only deepened the mess they were in. In frustration, he stomped on a quarter, and she tore up the document, wearing a smug expression of defiance. "Look here, Thomas. You can destroy this recorder, but nothing changes. The data is still saved on my computer. And Samantha, that document you just ripped wasn't the original." "You achieved nothing," I calmly explained, exposing their futile attempts to cover up the truth. For a long time, they seemed not to realize the seriousness of what was happening. "Oops," I said with light irony, addressing Samantha and highlighting their short-sightedness. "I also have a claim for all the savings you two spent, not to mention the cozy little time you had with this guy." My words struck them like a bolt of lightning. Faced with the reality of their actions and the legal consequences, both Thomas and Samantha couldn't hold back the tears, which streamed down their faces, revealing their vulnerability and confusion. The financial reckoning presented to Thomas was harsh but fair. The total amount demanded was $135,000. This included $8,000 for emotional damages, $100,000 for the down payment on the house, and $115,000 for other expenses, with an additional $4,000 to pay off a loan. Samantha's bill came to $35,000, covering $11,000 in miscellaneous expenses and $31,000 for a loan she had acknowledged with a promissory note regarding Ryan's claims. Their deliberate actions and frivolous spending only underscored the far-reaching consequences of their behavior, serving as a powerful reminder of the importance of honesty and responsibility in any relationship. I fully expected Thomas and Samantha to try and sue us, given their persistence and past antics, but our sharp lawyer had already anticipated such moves. The settlement documents included a clause stating that if they attempted legal action, they would undoubtedly lose, and no one would represent their interests. It was designed to make them think twice about their next steps, and in the end, we avoided any court battles. I packed up my belongings and left the house we had shared, and somehow, news of the whole ordeal spread to my workplace, which ultimately led to Thomas being transferred to another branch. This helped establish the distance I needed between us. But soon after, I received a message that caught me off guard. "Kelly, I miss you. Life feels empty without you. Can we give it another try?" he wrote, filled with longing and regret. I knew that going back to that cycle meant falling into the same trap again, and my answer was a firm no. Goodbye, I said, feeling a surge of determination swell in my chest. Then Samantha tried her hand, playing the family card, pleading with me. Kelly, think about my brother. What if we all live together again? Maybe we just misunderstood each other, and things could be better. But my response was equally resolute. Samantha, that's not going to happen. I'm sorry, goodbye. Both of them tried to persuade me, but I left them unanswered, cutting off all contact. Ryan, as it turned out, received the same kind of messages and chose to ignore them as well. One day, while driving past my old house in a cab, I noticed a "for sale" sign at the entrance. With all communication cut off and the settlement paid out, it was a clear sign that I was truly closing this chapter of my life. I had no idea how Thomas and Samantha were doing, and I didn't want to know. As for me, I was moving forward and upward with each passing day. I had bought a new apartment and was settling into my new life. Work was fantastic, and I had recently been promoted to regional director, the position I had been working toward for a long time. Ryan and I had grown closer, finding comfort and compatibility in each other's company. We had gone out together several times, and I found a surprising ease in our interactions. Life had improved significantly after the divorce, confirming that my decision had been the right one. As for what happened between Ryan and me, that's a story for another day.